a lot of the people who were making these loans that were based on, high risk expectations, if you will, were covering themselves against the failure of those loans. So in other words, if in fact Mr. Jones can't pay his mortgage, and if we have to foreclose, I don't lose money because I've insured myself against that possibility.
Right. The legal term for that is fraudulent conveyance, which is what the banks are guilty of. They made loans knowing that the people couldn't pay them back. And it goes back to American history when the British used to make loans to farmers in upstate New York and then call the loans in before the crops, knowing that they couldn't make the payments, and then they'd seize the assets. This is exactly what we're seeing here. They make the loans knowing that they can't be made. The same thing happening in Greece most spectacularly. And they're grabbing the assets. They're asset grabbers. It's a leveraged buyout artist. John Paulson, a hedge fund manager, was in Greece shortly before the collapse with Lloyd Blankfein having a meeting, as was Stephen Forbes, who I met personally in the lobby of the hotel where he was staying, and told me we're here to grab assets, essentially.
Well, here's what is mind-boggling to me. Is you are presenting a picture of intentionality, that people did things to further their own interests. They knew what they were doing. It was calculated. And yet, in most of the media, it seems as if it's presented as some sort of mistake, as miscalculation. We wanted housing to go up, but it went down. You can't blame us. Everybody was doing it, therefore nobody was doing it, therefore nobody can be prosecuted.
Well, let's assume that there was intention. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some would argue that it's a good thing to have people who are parasites in an economy, because parasites are useful. I have parasites in my intestines. They perform a useful function. The problem is the parasites don't run my heart, lungs, and brain. In America, the parasites write the regulatory framework that's supposed to be governing them, so the parasites run the show. Oh, and by the way, the parasites also own the New York Times and other mainstream outlets for the most part, so you don't have any adequate reporting. So the parasites have taken over. They write the laws with the money they made by engaging in these parasitical activities. This is one of the primary use of funds that is spilled out. And what's amazing to me is that the cost of buying rule changes in Washington, to buy a senator, to buy a congressman, is so cheap. You can get so much big, incredible bang for your buck. For $500,000, you can get a law change that'll pay off spectacularly, multi-billion-dollar payoff. I wish the senators and congressmen in America, at least, if they're going to take bribes, hold out for something a little bit higher, because they're cheap. They're like a $2 whore, and they cheapen themselves more than when they open their mouths and make ridiculous statements.
As we've noticed, the whores in Colombia want to get paid at a higher rate than the Secret
Service. They should be congressmen and lobby for a higher rate. Talk to the professionals about getting paid better.
I'd like to right now, though, turn to this whole question that I've been investigating, exploring, trying to explore. Who rules America? And what are the unelected forces behind the scenes that are not part of our elected democracy that is shaping our politics in our country? And one of them is certainly Wall Street. And what I'd like to try to do in a kind of primer type way, in a simple kind of way, is tell people, 3 or 4 things they need to know about this conglomeration of power, Wall Street, what it is, how it works, maybe how it can be resisted.
They spend some time searching for vulnerabilities. And this is something that I think activists don't do enough of. They have kind of a blanket message, and they try to morally assuage people. But the morality doesn't trade on the exchange anywhere. You can't buy or sell it, so in this country it doesn't exist. But if you look for vulnerabilities, that can be effective. And we identified a few years ago that a bank like J.P. Morgan, for example, that's short over 3 billion ounces of silver. If everyone in the world bought an ounce of silver, J.P. Morgan would have to declare bankruptcy within 6 months. And you'd get rid of a major financial terrorist. And that would be obviously a net benefit to the country and the global economy.
Well, describe the structure, though, for me. And how many big banks are there, and what do they actually do in our economy? How do they exercise influence and control in our country?
Well, there's major central banks around the world, the Fed, the ECB, Bank of England, Bank of Japan. They answer to the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. And they all have relationships with, like, a J.P. Morgan, for example. J.P. Morgan has $90 trillion worth of derivatives on their books. That's 5 times bigger than the entire GDP of America is on the books of J.P. Morgan in terms of debt. And a derivative is basically debt. And debt and fraudulent conveyance of debt is the old feudalism trick of indentured servitude. It's just been updated modern banking techniques, and the result is the same. People are born into debt, they live in debt, they'll die in debt, and this is being passed from generation to generation, and we're seeing a return of feudalism.
Stacey, you weren't born as a financial anti-terrorist or a financial journalist, but there's been a learning curve here for you. What have you learned about Wall Street and about how this whole system works that you think others should know?
I worked in Hollywood first, so I'm a filmmaker and storyteller. And when I first met Max, and I worked for Michael Phillips, who made Taxi Driver, one of the most famous New York films. And I met Max, and this was in 2003. And he was telling me the stories of what he did on Wall Street. And I didn't believe him because it wasn't being reported in the news. And I thought, surely this is against the law and these people would be in jail. There's no way you can commit these kind of crimes. But then that was the beginning of when things were starting to unwind anyway, a large part to do with the unfunded war in Iraq. And as the whole fabric of our finance and monetary system started to fall apart and the debt became so huge. And when things started to happen over and over, always in the Financial Times, that was and The Economist, or some of the best in terms of documenting some of these crimes happening. So I looked at it as a storyteller, and I thought that this is just, that the bad guy has to be punished. In a story, it has to happen. Since the days of Aristotle, you have to punish the bad guy, and we still haven't seen that yet. And I think that's why the financial crisis is continuing, and it won't get better until equilibrium and justice is restored.
What about the regulators? Are there regulators? What are they supposed to be doing in this mix?
Well, the attitude on Wall Street, and having worked on Wall Street, is that if there's a question about the legality of what we're doing, then the response is that the law is wrong and needs to be rewritten or changed, not that we're breaking the law. You saw this with the Facebook IPO and Goldman Sachs. They broke the law by letting more than the allocated number of shareholders have insider stock before it went public. And so they lobbied Congress and said, well, we didn't really break the law. The law hasn't kept up with what we do as financial engineers and innovators, so you need to change the law. So they went ahead and they changed the law. Now they have a new law, and it covers Goldman Sachs' criminality. Behavior was now covered because it's grandmothered or grandfathered under this law, which is now exonerates them from having committed any crimes. And this is why there's very few people in jail for the current crisis, is because all the criminality during the S&L crisis, where 1,500 or so bankers went to jail, all the laws that put them into jail have been taken off the books or rewritten by the people who are friends of the people who went to jail, so that when they did the thing again, they don't have to go to jail.
Does Wall Street also put a lot of money into politics? Is it buying up politicians?
Not only do they put money into politics, but there's a direct pipeline of insider trading. That they just had the Stock Act, Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, to try to curb the pipeline between Washington and Wall Street. So like Nancy Pelosi, for example, her time in Congress now, she's made millions of dollars trading on inside information, as have many of congressional people, because the law says that when something comes out of committee and there's information is going to affect the pharmaceutical industry, for example, the Washington can trade on that inside information. There's no law against it. So they're there getting quite wealthy on this.
But also on a very personal level, you have individuals from Wall Street that are essentially playing musical chairs with the cabinet of multiple, administrations. If they're saying, is Wall Street affecting, capital? Is Wall Street affecting our policy making? Well, they're becoming our policymakers, at least for a short period of time, and then returning back to the banks.
So it's a revolving door kind of thing.
Essentially. I mean, they're in and out of whether it be the Bush administration or the Obama administration, the different positions within the cabinet that are governing finance are individuals that are former CEOs of banks, or they might go back to being an honorary chair on the board of directors. It's this incestuous relationship between Wall Street and policymakers.
Sounds so corrupt.
Danny, you asked who runs America, and I say it's ignorance. And, Thomas Jefferson warned of this, and that we needed a media who would inform the population. Otherwise, we would lose our democracy. But the White House and the Congress have criminalized it, whether you see with a story with Andy, and you also just told the story about the factory farm chicken. They've just passed a law about you're not allowed to report on it. If you work at a factory farm, you're not allowed to tell anybody about it anymore.
Legislation.
Look at this fracking law in Pennsylvania, where doctors, if they have a patient who is sick due to the fracking chemicals, they're not allowed to tell them. So this is ignorance that is being forced upon you, criminalizing knowledge.
Max, you've said famously that when you ask about who rules America, it's really the algorithm now that's ruling America. Tell me about that. Tell us about that.
Well, 70% of the volume on the exchange is computer generated, and computers run on program trading, computer programs. And you now have, of course, Forbes magazine wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about computers that are able, with narrative software, to take prices from the exchange and create stories in any voice that they want in their magazine. So it could be like, okay, write a story about the closing prices in the technology sector in the voice of Danny Schechter. And they'll create a story and it'll appear in the magazine. So it's the computers are writing the stories, but the computers are also reading the stories. And then they do program trading based on algorithms, based on the stories that they just read. So you have the same computers both writing the stories and trading on the stories. This creates fake demand. The stock market at roughly 13,000 on the Dow Jones is primarily fake demand. The retail investor is gone. They're long gone. But the computers are buying and selling with each other to create this fake demand, presumably to lead up to this next election cycle, because this propaganda, what I call price propaganda. People want to feel like things are okay, and if Dow Jones is near its all-time high, then things must be, quote, okay. And it's all done by computers. There's not an actual supply and demand or market capitalism in place anymore. This is long gone. These are computers that have virtually unlimited credit because the cost of credit is now zero, and the ability for a bank like J.P. Morgan with a $90 trillion balance sheet of derivatives, they can lend $1 trillion to a computer program to make a bet. If the bet doesn't work, then they get a federal bailout. If the bet works, then they get a bonus. So it's heads they win, tails we lose. And this has been going on now for a number of years, but it's gotten shockingly more disproportionate and asymmetric.
But, Danny, also, we made a show for BBC World News called The Oracle with Max Keiser. And from December 2008, so well after the collapse of Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, the market's tumbling 1,000 points in a day, and the head of BBC World News Business said, and we had a 10-episode contract, do you think the financial crisis will last all the way through these 10 episodes?
So in other words, the people actually in charge of planning the coverage are very uninformed themselves.
Well, the mainstream media are themselves deeply in debt. The news organizations have become entertainified, and to compete, they take on enormous amounts of debt. So the bankers, they don't want to insult their creditors because they might cut off their lines of credit. So they're not unbiased in this regard in any stretch of the imagination. You see this most spectacularly with the New York Times. Their coverage of the Wall Street is pitiful, and they have this frontman, Jack Krugman, who is an apologist for this.
You mean Paul Krugman?
Paul Krugman. He's an apologist for these scallywags who are engaged in wholesale thievery and larceny.
Yeah, but Max, you've also said this many times that, we're at the end of a 30-year, it's an over 30-year bull market in the bond market and the stock market. And it makes people stupid.
Max, you have spoken a lot about financial terrorism. You've actually used the concept of terrorism as a way to denounce financial practices by major companies like Goldman Sachs and others. What do you mean by that? Why do you consider them terrorists?
Well, they're driven by an ideology. A selective reading of text. Let's take Islamic extremists, for example, that do a selective reading of the Quran, whereas Lloyd Blankfein will have a very selective reading of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he'll pick certain lines to justify his actions. They are willing to blow themselves up, or their family and friends in their belief system. So we saw that in 9/11. They're willing to take sacrifices for their ideology. A lot of them died because of their ideology. And we see that they think they're doing God's work. Lloyd Blankfein famously has said he believes he's doing God's work, just like any radical extremist. And, they have their own, I would imagine they have their, having been on Wall Street myself and having been down at Harry's at Hanover in Hanover Square, I know that the the idea of heaven for an average stockbroker is to die with 7 shots of Johnny Black. That's their version of the hereafter. So they have their own version of nirvana. And so you put it all together and you end up with, and they have weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett calls it. So you have an analogy. They're both funded by the same groups. They're both in it for the same game, to gain property and status. And they're cut from the same cloth. They just have different stylists.